Right, so good afternoon, our speaker, distinguished scholars, and then valued participants. On behalf of the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies, I am honored to welcome you to this esteemed platform, part of the Global African Diaspora Lecture Series. This initiative represents our dedication to fostering academic excellence and meaningful conversation that explore the rich history of our shared heritage. This event is being hosted at the African University of Communications and Business here at the Nketia Center. And we are thrilled to welcome all attendees joining us, both in person and virtually through Zoom. Together, we embark on a journey of learning and discovery that promises to challenge perspective, ignite promises, and ignite innovation, and deepen our understanding of our collective cultural legacy. Let us seize this opportunity to engage, reflect, and contribute to this academic discourse. Once again, welcome to this thoughtful, provoking session, and thank you for your presence. Thank you.
Okay, so on behalf of the African University of Communications and Business, we are delighted to welcome you to the Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies Global African Diaspora Lecture Series. This is a platform dedicated to insightful discussions on the experiences, contributions, and impact of continental Africa and the African diaspora. This series brings together scholars, thought leaders, and change makers to explore the rich tapestry of continental African and African diasporic history, culture, and innovation. We look forward to engaging conversations that inspire new perspectives and meaningful connections. So we thank you for joining us. The Nketia Center for Africana Studies is committed to becoming a leading center for Pan-African scholarship and collaboration, bringing together scholars and thinkers from the African world to conduct research and deliberate on issues affecting the welfare and destiny of African peoples, and to disseminate their findings as widely as possible. Additionally, the center will be an incubator for innovative research to generate new knowledge that advances professional practice for those at the cutting edge of transformative development. The center contributes significantly to the university's mission of, quote, preparing lifelong learners to become innovative problem solvers and ethical leaders in the fields of communication, business, and related areas through excellence in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and collaboration at the local, regional, and global levels using a Pan-African framework, unquote, as well as to the university's core value of, quote, embracing African cultural values, unquote. The university is not merely a university in Africa with an African label. Indeed, this is an African university with an ethos and the explicit intent to produce graduates who fully understand, appreciate, and unapologetically manifest their Africanness in all spheres of their lives. The need to provide an education at the tertiary level that enhances the self-awareness of students as Africans led to the establishment in 2009 of this center. The Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies was officially launched under its current name on the 22nd of June of 2015 as an interdisciplinary institution dedicated to the creation and advancement of knowledge about the peoples and cultures of Africa and the African diaspora through scholarly research, teaching, and publications aimed at the regeneration of African peoples and societies. Again, thank you for joining us, and you are welcome.
Welcome once again to the Africana Studies, Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. And then today we are here to dive into the topic or talk about lessons learned from the Maroons. And then our speaker for today's presentation or lecture is Dr. Kofi LeNiles. Dr. Kofi LeNiles studies Dr. Kofi LeNiles studies African-centered education and Maroons. His research delves into the positive impact of African-centered education on the socio-academic development of Black children. Additionally, he explores the history and legacy of Maroons, Africans who freed themselves during the Marfa transatlantic slave trade and established independent communities in the Western Hemisphere. His work centers on the influence of culture, epistemologies, and life experience on leadership, teaching, and learning. So, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting my time, shall you join me in welcoming our speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Kofi LeNiles.
Thank you, and thank you for such a warm introduction. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to thank you all for having me. It's an honor to talk to you all, to present to the Kobina and Ketia Center. I was first introduced to Nana's work in 2014 by Baba Kohane, who's out in Cape Coast. I was visiting Ghana for the first time, and he was discussing this scholar that everyone should read. And I was unfamiliar with the work of Nana. Um, and Nana Kohane went and actually grabbed the book on the Ghanaian paradigm and bought it to me and said, "You have to read this book." And that was my introduction to Nana and Ketia's work. So it's an honor years later to be speaking to you all. I also want to acknowledge that there are many who come before me, acknowledge our ancestors who paved the way for us, carved our history, our words, our ideas into stone so we would never forget, created deep culture so that no matter what we went through, we could always reattach to who we are at our deepest levels. Also want to acknowledge all of the great scholars who have come before me. This is a part of a series acknowledging those who have presented before me, acknowledging our elders who continue to pass on culture, knowledge, stories. That intergenerational transmission of culture is necessary. And I'm very just happy to be part of that. And also the master teachers who I continue to learn from, continue to sit at their feet, and understanding that this is a part of a deep legacy that I hope to continue and pass on to the next generation. So hopefully this lecture, this talk is worthwhile. You all learn something, as well as those who will interact with this in its recorded form. So I want to start there. I do have a presentation that I will share. There is a part of the presentation that will be a short video with some subtitles. So you'll have to pay attention to the screen when we get to that video portion. It's about 2 minutes, just so that you can see what the people are saying when I show that brief video. So I'm going to jump into my presentation, and there'll be some time for Q&A after. There is a part of the presentation where I'm going to be asking you to write. If you don't have anything to write with, you can use your cell phone. You'll just have to follow along and do the activity with your cell phone. So either something to write with or using your cell phone, but I'll guide you at that portion. So with no further ado, I'm going to share the PowerPoint. So you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to go into full screen mode. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Um, so I titled this Lessons Learned from the Maroons. I'm going to be focusing on a specific group of Maroons who are located in Colombia, South America. Most of my research on Maroons has been in Colombia, South America, although I've also traveled to Jamaica and Belize in an effort to learn more about Maroons in other spaces. So this is a picture of me when I first got into teaching. So I'm going to be really talking a lot about education. And when I first went into teaching, I didn't know much about teaching at all. I didn't go to a teacher preparation program, meaning a pre-service program where you learn how to teach. You learn the science behind teaching. I was an English major undergraduate, thinking that I would do something. I didn't know really what I wanted to do. This picture is a picture of me 4 months before I became a teacher. The people on the screen are my teammates. I did track and field when I was an undergraduate. I was a long jumper. So on the screen are long jumpers, sprinters, throwers. So this is us just out and about somewhere in Florida. So I find myself going into teaching. And one of the first questions that I asked when I became a teacher, I asked a veteran teacher, well, how do we help Black children understand the world, understand society, be critical thinkers? And I remember the teacher telling me, what's important is that they pass the test. And here in the United States, children who attend public schools normally take a test at the end of the year. And the test is supposed to measure how much they've learned. So I remember asking, well, what if they pass the test, but they can't critically think? They really don't know how to navigate society. They won't be successful in life, but they can pass a test. And the teacher's response was, they just need to pass the test. That's what matters. And I quickly learned that, at least the school that I was in, it wasn't about developing strong Black children. It was about every May, the children, whether or not the children can pass the test that they're going to be forced to take. So I started to think, well, what would it mean if we developed intelligent Black children who could think critically, who understood culture within this public school format? They almost would be anti-public education. And that was something that I truly didn't understand at the time, but I began to grow an awareness of what would it mean. You can see in one, there are a bunch of candles, and the Black child is the light bulb. What does it mean to innovate, to change the way that people view things, to change the very institution that you exist within? Every time I would go to a professional development, which is when the teachers would come together to talk about how do we become better teachers? How do we help our students learn more? Instead of having those conversations, we would talk about how do we help young people pass the test? And I found myself again perplexed. Like, I'm supposed to be a better teacher, but we don't talk about teaching. We don't really talk about children learning. We don't talk about how to help them become critical thinkers. We are focused on, in May, how do they do well on a test that we don't even create, that's given to us? Again, quickly learning that this isn't about helping Black children become critical thinkers, be able to contribute to their community. It's about measuring them in one way on this test that, as a teacher, I didn't even feel like mattered that much. So this notion of, do children pass, do children fail, became what was important in this school. It was what administration talked about. It was what the teachers talked about. But I never let it be what I focused on in the class. But I found myself becoming very tired of being a teacher in a public school in the United States. I was wondering, well, what else is there? What about the gifts and talents that children bring to the school? Are we not going to talk about them? Are we not going to talk about how to develop the uniqueness of each child? It became clear that there would be no critical thinking involved in education. that the curriculum in and of itself wouldn't be about critical thinking, wouldn't really be about developing strong Black children. It would be about preparing them for, again, what happened in May, which was that test. So it was about schooling and not education. I'm going to introduce definitions for each, according to Walimu Shuja. So Shuja talks about schooling. Here's the definition that Shuja gives us, is a process that is intended to perpetuate and maintain a society's existing power relations in the institutional structures that support those arrangements. He goes on to talk about all societies must provide schooling. It's a way for people to understand how to exist within the current society. But what's important is this idea of maintaining power relationships. If you're in a space like the United States, which is a very racist, white terroristic space, where people who are in power are doing what they can to maintain power, you can see how schooling allows for people to maintain power. You keep the populace or the population uninformed, unable to challenge your power, and therefore you are able to maintain it. Shuja then offers another idea, which is education. Shuja says that education is a process of transmitting from one generation to the next knowledge of the values, aesthetics, spiritual beliefs, and all things that give a particular cultural orientation its uniqueness. So education becomes this process of one, disrupting power by pulling people into an understanding of who they are culturally, this ability to critically think, this ability to connect yourself to the legacy of your people and challenge things that don't allow you to be self-determined, to actualize, and the things that allow you to be the best form or idea of those who have come before you. So here are the two definitions on the screen for you to see next to each other. Just take a couple of seconds, look at them, read them, get a sense of how Shuja situates schooling versus education, or education versus schooling. I quickly became aware that what we were doing in the school was schooling children and not educating them. And what children need is an education more than schooling. Not only children, but adults. We all need education over schooling. So as we think about this commitment, how are we committed to practice and transmit our culture through education? Education can be linked to kind of a cultural, philosophical orientation. So what is the purpose of education? The purpose of education is to grow what can perpetuate the best of who you are. As African people, we transmit our culture and we grow people, develop young people who can be dynamic enough to not only continue our culture, but also help our culture grows in ways that allow us to protect ourselves, allow us to develop that which must exist for our societies to improve, while schooling does the opposite. It maintains the status quo and keeps you locked into a certain space. Now, I want to talk about what happens when you can't practice your culture, but I want to do this through an experience. So this is what most children in the school that I worked in would experience when they went to school. They came in, they had a culture and a way of knowing, but the school said, you're going to come, you're going to learn the curriculum that we teach you so that you can do well on this test. If you're coming in and you have African ways of knowing, the test isn't measuring what you know as an African person. It's measuring what you've learned in this school, which is mostly Eurocentric, and whether or not you can do well on a test. So if you have something to write with, hold it up so I can see it. Okay, see a couple. If not, use your cell phone. Okay, open up either a blank screen on your cell phone that you can type into, or like a message box so that you can write a message. So I want you to do one thing and one thing only. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to write your name. When I say go, you're going to take 5 seconds and write your name. 1, 2, 3, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pencils down, stop writing. Okay, that's a normal experience. That's like using your culture in the school. You come in, you know how to do something, and you're doing it, right? You don't even have to think about it, right? Culture is something that we don't really think about. We just do. It's our way of knowing. It's our way of being. Now we're going to do the same activity. I want you to switch hands. You can only use one hand. Switch hands. 5 seconds to write your name. Ready, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop writing. Think about what that experience was like for you. Writing with your dominant hand, being able to do something that you don't have to think about, that you know you can be successful at doing, versus when you use your left hand, something that you're not used to doing, and then I'm giving you only a certain amount of time to do it successfully. Now imagine if I took what you produced with your left hand and said, I'm going to give you a score now. Either you're going to get an A, we use A, B, C, D, and F in the United States as scores. Some other places measure you at a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. But imagine if you got the lowest score for how you did with your left hand. And every day you walk into a school and you have to write or do tasks with your left hand, which isn't your way of knowing. That's not your way of being. And when you're not successful, people say, well, you're just not smart, right? In the United States, writing with your right hand, because our system is Eurocentric, is to know a lot about what it means to be a European, to think and act in ways that are European. So for Black children to be successful, for African children to be successful, when they come into schools, they, to some degree, have to forget who they are. They have to forget what it's like to write or use their dominant hand and start using their non-dominant hand, their left hand if you're right-handed. If you're left-handed, use your right hand. And then somebody's telling you that you have to be successful. So I quickly learned that the system is not set up for Black children to be successful because they aren't able to use their culture. They aren't able to use their ways of knowing. They're not given space to critically think. They're being taught that they must think through a certain lens, which is Eurocentric, and be successful in tasks that really don't help them move their community forward. So here are some things to consider that we've spoken about, but I want to put a pin in these. We're going to use these throughout, but for this portion, just have these in your mind because we're going to do a shift into Maroons. So it was about testing, not critically thinking, schooling over education, and schooling is a part of the European cultural thrust. So don't bring that African stuff into this space. This is a space that is going to teach things that are European and advance European ideas. I quickly realized that I wasn't going to be successful in public education and that I needed to do something different. So at that point, I left public education and I decided to move to Ghana for a year to consider what was going to be next for me. In that process, I began thinking about the type of educator that I wanted to be. And I started to think about an experience that I had in 2012. In 2012, I visited a Maroon village for the first time. So who are Maroons? Maroons are Africans who were kidnapped from the African continent and brought to the Americas, what is now called the Americas. They were forced into enslavement. Our ancestors were forced into enslavement, but Maroons are those who freed themselves and created sovereign, autonomous villages in the Americas. A lot of times they created these villages near mountainous terrain because it provided military advantage. You're coming into a mountain, strategically, I'm at an advantage, especially because you don't know where I'm at. I'm going to be in a forested area. So again, I have a military advantage. So these Maroon villages were strategically placed. And these are where we in the Americas continue to practice our African culture and defend these spaces that we created with our lives. If you're not familiar with Ma'afa, that is the more than 300-year period during which African people have been colonized, enslaved, experienced genocide, and involuntarily had our worldview shifted from an African-oriented one to one that is more European-oriented. And that has happened through spaces throughout the world, especially for Africans who find themselves in the so-called Americas and in spaces on the African continent. These are some of the spaces where you find maroon villages, whether it's in Cuba, Jamaica, the United States, whether you're in Suriname, whether you're in Colombia. There are maroons in Belize, in Honduras. There are maroons in Venezuela. There are maroons in Chile, in Ecuador, right? You've had this idea of African resistance. It is very real, and it manifests in the maroon villages being throughout the Americas. So when you think about Africans who were kidnapped, our ancestors who were taken from the continent, always have this idea that we resisted, we fought, we were successful, and we created spaces for us to practice African culture. Don't let that not be a part of the narrative. In the United States, it's not often spoken about. So it's removed from textbooks. But these maroon spaces exist throughout the Americas. Maroon societies are very unique, again, because these are spaces where we practice African culture and African ways of knowing. And these maroon villages, they still exist. One I'm going to discuss in depth is the one that I village in Colombia, South America. In visiting this village in 2017, with a colleague, we created a documentary about these maroons and what they were doing. I'm going to show a short clip of this documentary. It's just the preview of it, so you can have a better sense of who these maroons are, what they look like, what the village looks like, and some of the things that they are doing present day. I'll have to make sure that the next screen opens up. Can you all see this screen with the YouTube video?
No.
No, okay. Let me share a different screen. What about now?
Yes.
Yes. Let me make sure you can hear it too. Sometimes the audio is off.
I was born
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Yes. Great.
as a king in a small village. The smiles of my people and the rhythms of our drums welcome me into the world. My community and my parents nurtured me in mind, body, and soul. They taught me about unity, courage, and most importantly, how to lead. All the lessons I learned in Africa helped impact the lives of millions worldwide. Some of you may recognize my story and others will not. My name is Kim Benkos Yoho, and I am the founder of Palanque San Basilio.
Aquí siempre nos hemos considerado ser una sola familia.
Los palenqueros nos reconocemos como afrodescendientes, afrocolombianos, como palenqueros y como negros.
Freedom for the black community in Colombia. He never accept to be a slave. They thrive with the white people, they friend.
All humans need to be connected. Now listen, I shall tell you a story.
So in 2017, we developed that documentary on the Maroons in Colombia. The documentary revealed a couple of things for us. We also developed a children's book on their founder, Benkos Bioho. what we learned when shooting the documentary is that this was a successful African space in the Americas. They have 0% crime. The elders walk the village every evening. It's a council of elders. They basically serve as what we've been taught to view as police, but they go around the village, they talk with families, and they settle any dispute using dialogue, African ways of knowing. Families are intact. 100% of the adults who are of age to be married are married. Again, there's no violence. There are no instances of divorce, because when there are families between husband and wife, the entire family comes together to solve them. There's no child abandonment, meaning that children are not in foster care. They still practice African age sets, which they call quadros. So when you are of a certain age, you're placed into a quadro with people who are similar age, and they grow up as lifetime brothers or sisters, depending on your gender. So the age sets are still practiced in this space. And we were amazed to see, wow, after over 400 years, you still practice African culture in this space in Colombia, South America. From their perspective, they believe that it is the practicing of African culture that advances their psychosocial well-being. They believe that all institutions must be culturally centered, and that by doing so, you develop young people who are prepared to address any challenge that you will face. Hence, over 400 years, they've been transmitting the best of their culture to ensure that they are able to address challenges, especially in this new place called the Americas. So we return to Suja and Suja's idea of education. They're transmitting culture to the next generation, right? So they're educating their children in all spaces, or in most spaces, in their community. So this is what we saw when we were developing this documentary. One of the spaces that we were not able to enter into was the school. So this is what we saw as we went into other institutions in the village. We learned that education is constantly occurring. One example that we saw was speaking with a person in the community, and they said, you know, when I was young, I would go out into the forest with my grandfather, and my grandfather would have me pay attention to the different trails that were left by snakes. And by the time I was a certain age, I could look at the way that the grass moved to tell what snake had passed through that area. No matter where I went, I was always learning, whether I was with my grandparents, my parents, an aunt or uncle, or someone else in the community. Education is constantly occurring. So I became interested in knowing more about, well, if it's constantly occurring in the community, what's happening when children go into the public school? Because from my experience in the United States, the Black community can have some really good things going on. But when we cross over into these public institutions, many public schools in the United States do not prioritize or center African culture. So I was wondering, does your public school center African culture? Do the ways in which you organize and live in the community transfer to the school? Or is something else happening in the school? Right? So again, all of these beautiful things that are happening in the community. To do that, I set up a study where I would talk to people, ask them questions and interview them. I would observe what's happening in the school. I would look at some of the documents from the school to learn more about what are the experiences of teachers and leaders and really students at this public school in the Maroon village. So something unique about this public school in the Maroons, this specific group of Maroons went into a 200-year period of isolation where they didn't really talk with anyone from the outside. They believed that this was a way of grounding themselves culturally and strengthening who they were. They came out of isolation about 70 years ago. Their public school is a little less than 50 years old. So even the idea of having a public school, of interacting with the outside, is newer to this village. One of the things that they noted more recently is that some of the children were beginning to not practice the culture, that they were beginning to kind of think through a European lens, worldview. And they wanted to make sure, this is another thing that we learned, that they viewed the school as a resource to not disrupt their culture versus one that would cause some sort of cultural disturbance. Those were things that I learned before going into the school. So some of the things that I learned from the teachers and the leaders, that they view the role of educators in this school as one that advances the culture. They want students to learn how to speak their language in the school. They have a very unique language that has a Bantu base with Spanish Creole features. They want students to learn the ways in which they conceptualize the world. So they have different mechanisms in the school that come from Angola, such as a scale that comes from Angola, and it's their traditional method for weighing things. They view elders as a resource that should be able to go into the school, talk with students, support children. In the school, we saw that the quadros are alive and well. Students organize in their quadros. Are there aid sets? And they're able to use that as a way of advancing culture in the school. We also saw that there are aspects where they teach their story. These are things that the community wanted, and when we went into the school, we actually saw it. Like, they're teaching who they are. They're teaching, how did we get here? Why are we here? What are the things that we want as a community? So ways in which culture is reconstructed and advanced in the school. I also noted that in the school, there's cultural warfare happening, because the school does serve as a mechanism to introduce European ideas and ways of knowing to young people, similar to how schools function in the United States. Why does this happen? Well, the teachers who work in the school are selected by the government. So you have non-African teachers teaching African children in this space, in the school. Some of them do not identify as African or Black, and they shared, that's not my history or culture. Why should I teach it? It's not my way of knowing. Some operate through an African worldview, while others operate through a European lens, right? So you have some who are Maroons, some who are from other African villages. And these teachers teach from this perspective of, this is my worldview, this is my way of knowing, this is what I'm transmitting. There are others who only know how to operate through a European lens. So they're there and they're advancing ideas that come from European culture. We also saw that there were some who were pro-African, and then there were some who were anti-African. And again, just said, I'm here because I have to be here. I was placed here by the government. When I can transfer schools, I will. Right? So this idea that there is cultural warfare happening at the school, those who want to advance African culture, while those who are actually disrupting it. One teacher who we spoke with specifically said that teachers who hold neo-colonialist viewpoints are spreading it in the school. So you have teachers who are spreading a colonizing worldview, or colonizing ideas to children, to African children in this space, which was disturbing, but it's still very real. A different teacher shared that there are those who are not interested in learning about their culture, and that in general, the broader curriculum in Colombia advances European culture. So if you have a school in a Maroon village, it's going to spread European culture because that's the curriculum that they receive. So while you have these African ways of knowing, such as quadros that exist in the school, you have some of the mechanisms used for math, weighing. There are other pedagogies, or teaching methods for teaching that come from Africa that are used in the school. there's still all of this Eurocentric stuff happening in the school that pushes against the African worldview, African ideas, African ways of knowing, which again leads to this cultural warfare happening in the school. I walked into the science classroom. This is a great example. And I looked around and there were nothing but white men painted on the walls. People like Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein. And I said to the teacher, you only have white men on the wall, white so-called scientists on the wall. Why don't you have African scientists on the wall? And the teacher shared that the contributions that African people have made to science aren't as significant or meaningful as those that white people have made, which is why in this African village inside the school, she decided to put white men on the wall. So you can see the ways in which this is it's antithetical to what we experienced in the broader community and what we highlight in our documentary. Some of the things that we learned as we interviewed people, as we observed this Maroon village. So this school almost serves as something that's in isolation. It's like you're crossing through a portal, and that's where you start to be introduced to European ideas in this very Black space. Now, if you saw some of the footage from the documentary, so you might have noted, well, I saw people with jeans, I saw people with certain types of shirts. So obviously people do wear European style clothing in this space, and that's very true. But when you think about the space where you have a large amount of European ideas being introduced to these African children, the school is one of the sites where in the rest of the community, those institutions really do center an African worldview. So just this importance of African history, culture, and worldview being taught in all spaces in the community, with the school serving as one where it's taught in some classes and not taught in other classes. So in many ways, the village is engaged in this continuous process of reconstructing and advancing their culture. What we know is that the village was founded between 1603 to 1610. So you're talking about a space that has existed for more than 400 years in the Americas. And you can see the ways in which the socialization process is advanced, the rituals are advanced, but you can see the ways in which they are also being disrupted. And there's this loss of cultural elements that's happening, and you can see how the school is a part of that loss, being that you have those in the school who are not interested in just teaching things that are African. So I want to go into one of the big learnings that I've experienced in the Maroon villages. So one is that culture is essential to maintaining one's African identity. The ability to practice culture, the ability to use culture and apply culture to everyday situations, and the ability to be successful in your application of culture. So when you enter into non-Africanized spaces, and especially a non-Africanized educational space, and your culture is disrupted and you're forced to apply other ways of knowing, the very things that you value can almost be, I don't want to say lost, but you can see the ways in which children in these spaces need a more Africanized experience and a holistic Africanized experience. Hence the importance of African-centered schools. So one of my biggest takeaways from my experience with the Maroons is the need for an African-centered school in that space. You have these institutions that are Africanized and African-centered, but the school is not one of them. So one big takeaway is that there's this need to transform the school into an African-centered school in this Maroon village. What do I mean by African-centered school? So I'm using the Council of Independent Black Institutions definition for African-centered education. So African-centered education, I'm going to read it, is the means by which African culture, including the knowledge, attitudes, values, and skills needed to maintain and perpetuate it throughout the nation-building process is developed and advanced through practice, right? So this is African-centered schools. This is what's needed in the Maroon village. Children need to be able to come and use their culture, think through their culture, build together using their culture, and advance their culture through the practice of it, especially in an educational institution. So this idea that schools can be part and parcel of instilling a cultural awareness and also an authority to use your culture no matter where you go in the world. Because if the school is a space where you can't use culture or where culture is being disrupted, perhaps you go into other institutions and you start saying, well, this is another space where I can't use my culture. And if I can't use my culture, then whose culture are you using in that space? In the United States, Black children often learn when they go to public schools that this is a space where I can't use my culture, or my culture will be disrupted. And that is part of a process where we start going into, and I'm going to say we, where people in the United States start going into other spaces and going, well, this is a Europeanized space. I can't use my culture here. So I have to, we call it code switching. I have to start code switching and acting different in this space versus just being who I am, dressing like an African, talking like an African, socializing like an African, being who I am no matter where I go. A part of getting to that point to where you're comfortable being who you are in all spaces is being able to do that and practice that in an education space, a space where you are solving problems, a space where you are building community, and thinking through challenges with other children who are African. So this helps to shape your identity and outlook. It helps to, what we were talking about earlier, it helps to establish the type of critical thinking, criticality that you can apply to the rest of the world. African-centered education also advances, according to Shockley, 7 distinct precepts or concepts. One is an understanding that Black people everywhere are in fact Black, right? This idea of Black nationalism too, which is point 5. Pan-Africanism. All people of African descent are Africans and share a common destiny. African-centered education advances re-Africanization, which is this idea of cultural reattachment and attaching to African culture and going deep in that attachment. Adopting traditional or indigenous African values into one's life. I already spoke about Black nationalism. The 6th one is people of African descent must fully control educational institutions where Black children learn. Hence, this idea that we need to form independent schools because we do not control public schools. Those are controlled by governments. So if the government does not want to advance African-centered ideas or African cultural ideas and you don't control them, then the school will advance whatever the larger cultural thrust of that nation is. So African people must control educational institutions. That's something that's essential to African-centered education. And then as we discussed with Suja, the idea of education over schooling. So one of the things that I've learned during my time in my exploration of this specific Maroon village is that there is a urgent need for African-centered education to be part of, to support the other African-centered institutions that exist throughout the village. This learning, I think, can be applied to spaces outside of the Maroon village, right? There's an urgent need for African-centered education in the United States. There's an urgent need for African-centered education in Ghana. There's an urgent need for African-centered education throughout the Caribbean. There's an urgent need for African-centered education in South America. Wherever Black children are, there's a need for African-centered education. And the Maroon village is not outside of that. There's a need for it there as well. So I will end there and open it up to some Q&A. And I appreciate you all letting me go through that in a quicker manner so that we can have time for Q&A. So I will open it up to you all and answer anything that's coming up.
Oh, so thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. We thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Brother Kofi LeNiles, Dr. LeNiles. Let's start with any questions that may be pressing among our audience here in-house. We'll also take some questions or observations from online. Anyone want to start? Anyone want to start? Okay, well, I have a series of questions as usual. So I think you all want me to initiate the questions today, right? Okay, and then you all will take up from there, right? Okay, great. So let me pick a question that I think will have relevance to all of us. My first question is, what steps can contemporary Black youth take to return to the source, as Amilcar Cabral articulated, or re-Africanize? Or another way of stating that is, what steps can contemporary Black youth take to have a deeper appreciation of education over schooling? That's my first question. And I want to append a second question to that one, because I think it has a lot to do with particularly our youth, particularly on the African continent, but I'm also aware in the diaspora. What advice can you give to a youthful generation who view education, especially in Africa, especially in Ghana, in the African continent, as a means of joining the economic elite?
That is a great question. Advice. I think one of the I'll address it and then come back to the question. African people have a deep legacy of being experts, right? We are the first experts on the planet. Education is a process that allows us to move toward expertise. If we go back to a civilization such as ancient Kemet, where we were building pyramids, that took expertise, and it took expertise at multiple levels, right? So you can see that there were experts across the society. Expertise is what allows you in the current society, the current global order, to make money. But expertise also allows you to innovate and transform the way that society and the world works. Sometimes when we seek to only make money, what we do is we slot ourselves into someone else's economic order. We become those who, instead of innovating, are advancing somebody else's ideas, and they pay us very well to not disrupt what they have going. So for youth who are interested in understanding how they can make money, the best way to make money is to understand who you are and develop a deep expertise in the things that you care about, which is part and parcel of the African tradition. I think ways in which we get confused about what we should be doing and how we should be going about doing it, whether you're an adult or whether you are a youth, is when we don't know our history. When we start to think that things, especially ideas in math and science, because I know STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as we call it in the United States, and similar in Ghana, people think STEM is not something that comes from us. We are the original innovators of STEM. We created science. We created the idea of technology. We were the first engineers. We were the first mathematicians. That is our legacy. That is who we are. We have to study who we are. We have to know who we are. And a part of that means putting down cell phones. A part of it means putting down the laptops and going into a deep study, studying alongside other youth, studying with adults and elders, and getting a deeper understanding of what our traditions entail, so that when we use this expertise to innovate, we're not doing it in a way that is anti-African. so that becomes important. So advice to the youth: study, study alongside other Africans, other youth, and get a deep understanding of who we are and what our legacy is, so that innovation becomes something that we own, something that you can then help other people find space around. So if I innovate, I develop technology, I can employ others who can help advance this thinking and idea. So we need to innovate, but we also need to own those innovations. We need to innovate in African ways, and that comes by knowing who we are and attaching ourselves to a tradition that we're carrying forward.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent response. Anyone else with a question or concern? It can be an observation. No one. Okay, so I'll proceed with a second question. There's been a lot of talk about raising consciousness as well as the importance of raising behavior, particularly in African-centered circles. Could you give us some insight about how you think about that notion of we have to move beyond just raising consciousness and awareness to actually changing our behavior or raising behavior as well? And you've alluded to some of these things throughout your presentation, but any additional insight would also be valuable to our audience.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I was actually speaking to a group of educators last week, and one of the educators raised this idea of behavioral management in a schooling context. And they said, we have to manage behavior. And I challenged the educator and said, we're not managing behavior, we're developing behavior. The things that we are doing in classrooms should help students understand more about who they are, one, but two, it should also help students understand what needs to be done to be successful in life. So when talking about developing behavior, a lot of it is according to principles and ideas. In my household, we follow the Nguzo Saba. So my children understand that. They can name it. They can attach their behaviors to it. So when they think through something, so if my child does something, I'll give an example. Give me 1 second. If you can, let me remove this filter. So if you can see this, this is something that my son created, right? So my son, shout out to Baba Samori and Kamali Academy. My sons, both of them, log into Kamali Academy daily, and one of the assignments that they had was to create their own Adinkra symbols, to name the Adinkra symbols, and then to give them some sort of meaning. So I'll hold it back up. This is one that my I'll do. Let's do this one. He said Waka. Waka is family and joy. If you can see that, right? He has Afo. Afo means laughter. He has Dwafa, which means cleanliness. Bomine, which means kindness, right? So this is a way of developing behaviors, ideas that govern one's life. But in the household, one of the things that we celebrated around our child is you're showing your kuumba, your creativity, right? So that the child walks with this notion that I am creative, that a part of the way that I show the best parts of self is to be creative. When our child shows self-determination, we honor the fact that they're displaying Kujijakalia. So attaching them to these values, to these ways of knowing, as ways of raising consciousness while raising behavior. So can we identify the things that young people are doing and connecting them to an African worldview, African ways of knowing and being? I think that that becomes very important. I also think that a part of raising behavior is identifying the behaviors that aren't going to help you be successful. So if you're in that room, which there are several of you there, can you name 5 behaviors that if you showed today, you would know that they would pull against your success, meaning they would prohibit you from having a successful day? Can everybody in the room name 5 or think of 5? Right? You should be able to think of 5, name 5 that will pull against you having a successful day. You should also be able to name 5 that would help you be more successful throughout your day. Naming those at the beginning of the day and then reflecting on whether or not we displayed those behaviors throughout the day is another way of raising the types of behaviors and centering the types of behaviors that will help us be successful as a community and at the personal level. But I think sometimes we get away from this idea of developing behaviors, understanding them, and advancing them, and we start getting into how do we manage behavior? How do we manage these things, which sometimes pull us out of our greatness and prohibit what we can achieve in a 24 hours, over a week, over a month.
Very good. Thank you very much, sir. I'm aware that you have a class coming up today, so I think we have about less than 5 minutes. I want to give anyone else an opportunity to ask a question or engage with our speaker today. Anyone? Okay, yes, sir. Come towards the, can you come to the camera so the people online can hear you as well? Thank you.
All right. Yes, sir. Please, I want to ask if there were any figures or leaders among the Maroons whose leadership stands out in history.
That is a great question. I think there are several leaders who people will point to. One is Nanny in Jamaica, Nanny and the Maroons. They'll also point to Kojo of the Jamaican Maroons. If you're in South America, Benkos Bioho is a major figure. You have Zumbi, who is a leader, and people would say in present day Brazil, but Zumbi was a leader who was liberatory. I actually have developed some things around Zumbi that I'll be releasing soon for people to learn a little bit more about Zumbi and his experience. So those are 3 that I think if you start to go into Maroons, you'll come across, and their characteristics, especially the ways in which they advance African culture, protect the community, you'll see that there are some similarities across those Maroon leaders. I think one of the things that everyone in the room can do is identify a Maroon group that you want to learn more about and start to go deeper into that group and share it in your group. Right? So there are, I'm counting, I think there are like 7 or 8 of you in the room. Those are 7 or 8 different Maroon groups that you all can study and then come back as a group and share what you found. And then that helps to bring, as we talk about raising consciousness as well as raising behavior, it helps to bring ideas and behaviors into the space that allow us to understand what our ancestors have done to maintain their African culture, ways of being, but also what they've done to develop society and community, which are always helpful as we consider our current experience and how we're continuing to develop strong societies in the community for the purpose of African liberation and self-determination.
Okay, thank you. Do you think the treaties some Maroons groups signed with the colonial powers helped or harmed their long-term freedom?
That's a wonderful question. Man, I think treaties when you make a deal, it's going to limit what's possible. I think as we were talking about Maroon leaders, I think a Maroon leader like Zumbi, who was asked to sign a treaty that would force them to no longer accept Africans who were coming into Quilombo. And Zumbi refused to sign the treaty and said, I'd rather go to war than not accept my brothers and sisters who are coming out of enslavement and seeking freedom, right? And Quilombo was a space that decided to fight war instead of seeking some sort of treaty or peace. There are others who signed those treaties, and I think that they are harmful. I think that when you make a deal that in some ways, and I'm speaking of the ones that, especially the ones that prohibited groups from accepting other Africans who were freeing themselves and seeking an Africanized space, that they were harmful. But another way that I want to answer that question is that Maroonage was supposed to be, Maroonage can be thought of as kind of like a stopgap, right? It wasn't supposed to be the permanent situation. You're thrown into enslavement, you free yourself, you create a village so that you can practice your African culture, but you're supposed to move on to something from there, which is more of like this grander nation building. Treaties in some ways prohibit the ability to engage in this larger advancement of nation building because many of the treaties were designed to prohibit that. So I understand in many ways the challenges that Africans have faced and continue to face in the Americas. And I do understand what treaties provide in terms of space to have so-called peace. But history has shown that many of these treaties harmed our ability to continue to advance and engage in nation building because it restricted what was possible, or else we would be breaking the treaty, which will automatically thrust us back into war. So individuals like Zumbi are excellent to look at in terms of what was proposed and what was rejected. You can look at the Jamaican Maroons, Nanny, as well as Maroons who are in like Charlestown to understand more about the treaties they were presented with and whether or not they accepted them. But I think what you asked is a wonderful question, especially as we continue to be faced with treaties to not advance African culture, right? To not advance nationhood, to not come together as an African continent, to secure our resources, and create, from a Kwame Nkrumah perspective, a United States of Africa, where our well-being, our futures are actually linked to each other. So I hope I answered it and addressed it in a broader way.
Yes, thank you very much. We also have a comment from Dr. Willis, Essie Madge Willis. She notes that this is an excellent presentation, the comparison between the Maroons and the current situations and the examples from the ways of the Maroons really highlights what we need to do and can do. Thank you very much for that excellent observation as well. I think we're just about out of time, but I want to give anyone who may have a closing comment or question. Otherwise, I will take the liberty to throw my last question out. It's regarding what you spoke of on centering African culture. Centering African culture. And it may be a bit controversial, but I think it's necessary. How can African people be convinced to have the will or the courage to go against the grain of an anti-African educational system?
That is a great question. And I think one of the reasons why it's such a great question is because our children aren't doing well in an anti-African system. It seems like the most logical thing to do is to go against the grain and provide an Africanized experience. When you look at, I'll use the United States as an example. When you look at the performance of Black children who attend public schools, whether it's academics, whether it's social emotional well-being, they're not doing well. So the current ways in which things are done don't work for Black children. Why not try something different? If you move that out, right, and we go to a bird's eye view and look at other aspects of Black or African society, the ways in which the current order is set up is for us to not be economically advantaged. It's for us to not be militarily advantaged. It's for us to not be advantaged in so many other ways. It seems like the most logical thing to do would be to center African culture, to center yourself, so that you can do the exact opposite of what's happening now, which is leading to, which is having negative results. So if I'm not doing well in a Eurocentric system, perhaps I'll do well in an African-centered system. It seems logical to me. I'm always surprised when people don't want to do it. And I'll give an example of why I think it's so hard. I think we have to imagine a world where we are centered. So I live in the United States, right? And when I walk out today, I can promise you, the majority of Black people that I'm going to see, they're going to have their hair straight, either permed or some sort of sew-in. If it's a woman, if it's a man, he's going to have his hair cut a certain way and have a very sharp edge up, and wear his facial hair a certain way that is more closely resembles like a European, while the woman will have her hair straight, which resembles kind of like a European woman's hair. They're going to dress in European clothing, right? Again, to resemble the European. They're going to speak English, which is a European language, is not an African language. So they're going to aesthetically present themselves as European through hair, makeup, dress. They're going to use language like a European and talk like one. They're probably going to walk like one, right? And that's been normalized. We think that that's normal. Now, you're in the room. I cannot imagine, well, I can imagine, but I know it's not going to happen. If European people were walking around, let's say they were walking around the United States and they all were like, I got to go to the store and buy products so I can have an afro and wear my hair like a Black woman. I got to go to the store and buy kente so I can wear a dashiki and dress like a Black man. I'm going to watch YouTube videos to learn how Black people dance and walk so I can walk like a Black person, and have an entire continent, the entire continent of Europe, with afros, dashikis, and speaking tree, and dancing and walking like Black people. We would think that that is crazy because we don't have a worldview, that our perspective that even allows that. But when we do it, when we dress like them, talk like them, walk like them, act like them, we don't think that there's anything wrong with it. So we have to shift the worldview. We have to see ourselves centered and say that the smartest thing we can do is be ourselves. Being successful is linked to being who we are and not being other people, wanting to talk, act, think, and dress like them. A lot of times we just aren't there, but we have to let those types of thoughts enter into our minds where we are centered, we are normalized, and when we wake up, we see ourselves, we dress like ourselves, we talk like ourselves, we act like ourselves, and we let institutions reflect and build around that.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. We greatly appreciate your engagement with our students and with our online audience. Let's give Dr. LeNiles a round of applause.
Thank you for having me. And
Yes,
yeah, a BB for Hoda, right? That's what we have to. Yes, we have to be pushing forward.
Okay, so are you going to do some closing remarks? Great, Mr. Man.
All right, once again, to us. Thank you for your presentation. Indeed, we are really inspired once again. with your presentation you've given to us. And then we are hoping to see you face to face next time. And then we would like to extend warmly appreciation to our audience, those that have been able to join us in person, and then those that have also joined us online through Zoom. We appreciate your time and then your efforts that you've given onto us. And then once again, if today is the first time you are joining us online or in person, I'd like to encourage you to get YouTube and then get to your search bar and then type Kwabena Nketia Center for Africana Studies. And then you are going to get all our lecture series, and then you'll be able to watch them to also be inspired. Once again, we appreciate your time, and then see you next week. Thanks.
So thank you very much. As we conclude this session of the KNCAS Global African Diaspora Lecture Series, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speaker and participants for their insightful contributions and participation. Today's discussion has deepened our understanding of continental Africa and the African diaspora's impact and significance. I encourage us to carry forward the knowledge and inspiration gained here, fostering continued dialogue and collaboration. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Until we meet again, keep the conversation alive.